His goal was to play in the NFL, and he worked really hard in order to make the team.
He's a basketball player too, as well, being this big giant of a man, but he was literally a teddy bear. Everybody liked him.
I heard about 5 to 7 gunshots. Pop, 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 pop.
They weren't sure if he was going to survive.
I don't care how big this dude is, this isn't gonna be good.
Witnesses told us about the fight that happened at the club.
We knew right off the bat, he was pissed.
He was hell-bent on revenge.
He was waiting for the perfect opportunity, and he seized it.
Jacksonville, Florida is known for beaches, palm trees, and year-round warm weather. But for locals, it's something else that makes the city special.
In Jacksonville, you only have one professional team. So with that being said, it's not like you have a basketball team that you can also root for. It's just the Jags here. There's not like there's this huge college team here. When you are in Jacksonville, you are going to be a Jags fan.
Football season is barely underway on Tuesday, September 2nd, 2008, when the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office gets a frantic call just before 3 a.m.
I called 911 and I told them that somebody's been shot. He's a football player.
The victim was Richard Collier, was an NFL football player for the Jaguars.
The caller, Natalia Corby, reports that Richard was shot in his Escalade while parked outside her mother's apartment, where she now waits with her sister and another friend.
They're all waiting inside of the house because they don't know if that shooter is still out there. At this point, it's an active shooter situation. They have no clue if Richard is even dead or alive at this point.
Natalia urges the operator to send help quickly.
All of us were just in shock and, kind of pacing. I'm crying. We're trying to figure out what's going on. The ambulance pulled into the back. Then the police arrived and pulled into the back as well. We meet them outside. I immediately thought that he had passed away. I heard how many shots had went off, and I was like, wow, he has to be gone.
But first responders find that Richard is alive.
Mr. Collier was in the passenger seat of his own vehicle. He was unconscious, of course, and he was suffering the severe injuries.
He'd been shot numerous times. Mr. Collier was in critical condition.
I remember them taking the gurney out and putting him on there.
They immediately rushed him to the hospital to see if there's anything they can do to save him.
It was just a blur for me. I was just too busy crying and, in a state of disbelief.
Richard Collier was born on October 23, 1981, in Shreveport.
Richard Collier came from Louisiana. He comes from a very humble background.
He had a single mom. He had some sisters that were super supportive of him. He had an escape with football and basketball. He was a basketball player too.
As his love for sports grew, so did Richard. By high school, he towered over his classmates at 6 feet 7 inches.
Richard was a dreamer, and he had this drive to become this successful football player, and he wasn't going to let anything get in his way. He had some bumps along the road,
most of which came in the form of schoolwork.
His grades weren't the greatest when he was in high school, so no colleges will look at him, even though he was very athletic.
Following high school, Richard lived at home with his mom and became a working man.
He was stocking shelves at Walmart. He's doing what he's got to do.
He ended up working a regular job for a couple of years before he said, you know what, it's time for me to get serious about football again. He decided that, he was going to go to community college, get his grades back on track, and then become focused again.
He started playing football again, and then he transferred to Valdosta State, where he performed exceptionally.
It was a big football program. He excelled there. He was All-American.
In 2006, Richard caught the eye of NFL scouts. The Jaguars invited him to a post-draft camp.
He ended up becoming an undrafted free agent with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He made the team, and, he was proving himself.
His goal was to play in the NFL, and he worked his butt off to get there. He was somebody who struggled in life, and he succeeded, and he made it to the NFL.
Most people that want an NFL career, it's, you may be good at high school, you might be good at college, but it's an elite crew to be in the NFL.
Richard fit right in and took on the role of offensive tackle.
He was this big giant of a man, but he was literally a teddy bear. Everybody liked him.
There was no shortage of fun to be had off the field. In the spring of 2008, Richard enjoyed hitting the clubs, often accompanied by sisters Jamelia and Natalia Corby.
When I met Richard Collier, I was with my sister Natalia. We were having fun, just drinking. Eventually, I think he came and spoke to me, and we exchanged numbers. We went clubbing, that was our thing. We'd go to bars, stuff like that. Go to the beach, just, partying. He was very sweet, very nice, friendly. He would talk about his family a lot. I loved that about him.
Jamelia and Richard dated casually.
I don't watch football. I didn't know who he was. It's been like a couple months, and I didn't hear from him as much, and I thought he was ghosting me, so I was sending him all kind of messages. He's like, I was in training camp. He said he couldn't call during training camp because they weren't allowed to have their phones. That's when I found out he played football.
Richard liked to have fun, but he kept his head in the game.
He's being responsible. And, his family, he was trying to take care of his family. He's a good guy.
He had been in Jacksonville for approximately 3 years. He had worked really hard to accomplish this dream.
But Richard's third season with the Jags ends before it begins. As Richard is rushed to the hospital with multiple gunshot wounds, detectives arrive at the scene. They find Jamelia and Natalia Corby, as well as Richard's teammate, Kenneth Petway.
We're a few hours from daylight. I knew we'd get a better look at the scene after the interview, but we knew we had to go at them for the story. They were very emotional. They were scared.
They separate me and my sister. They put us both in separate cop cars, and they take us to the station.
We transported the sisters separate just to keep their statements in their truest forms and uninfluenced by each other, because people will fill in the blanks for each other.
Kenneth Petway remains on the scene and speaks with detectives.
Kenny was good friends with Mr. Collier and was in the car when the shooting occurred. but then ran into the apartment immediately after.
Kenny is losing his mind. He is frantic. He's very emotional. You know, he thought he was gonna die.
While detectives give Kenny time to calm down, they take in the scene.
I remember seeing the red Escalade that Mr. Collier was in at the time of the shooting. I believe it was still running, the lights were on.
The rear passenger door is open. You can see bullet holes going through the seat where Mr. Collier was.
Mr. Collier was in the front passenger seat, and the driver's side rear door was left open by one of the females when she exited the car to go inside. And it seems like the suspect came up and shot through that open door, through the back of the seats into Mr. Collier.
You see casings out on the ground. We had 6 to 7 casings at the scene.
They are grouped close together, offering up a clue.
More than likely, with the proximity of everything, the closeness of it, we knew we had one shooter. The shell casings were 45 caliber. You know, 45 caliber is a very large handgun round.
Between the caliber and the number of shots fired, detectives are concerned about Richard's chances at survival.
I didn't think he was gonna make it. I thought this was gonna be a homicide, especially when I knew the caliber, you know, at the scene was a 45. I knew how many gunshot wounds he had. I don't care how big this dude is, this isn't gonna be good.
In the early morning hours of September 2nd, 2008, Jacksonville Jaguars offensive tackle Richard Collier undergoes emergency surgery at Shands Hospital.
He wasn't expected to make it. His body had multiple gunshot wounds. It was gonna be a long surgery, and it was gonna be a long recovery or time before we could get to speak to him in person, if he even makes it.
Back at the scene, Detective Dennis Sullivan interviews Kenny Petway, the man who was inside the car when Richard was shot.
So as part of this investigation, they had to rule out Kenny Petway to make sure that he wasn't being targeted and also making sure he wasn't involved in the case in any way.
According to Kenny, Richard reached out to him earlier in the evening, knowing he'd just received bad news.
Kenny was feeling down from just getting cut from the team. So Richard decided, hey, let's get out and have a good time and go to the club. So he invited his friends, Jamelia and Natalia, to go with them to the club that night.
Kenny says they met up with some other teammates at the Square One Club.
They were just having a good time. They were all hanging out that evening.
By 2 a.m., the party was winding down.
All 4 of them decide that, hey, it's time to go home. So they leave 30 minutes before the club lets out, and they're on their way. Richard and Kenny, they're in one vehicle. Kenny's driving. They're following the Corby sisters home to the Riverside neighborhood.
Kenny Petway was driving Richard's car because Richard had a DUI not too long ago, and he was trying to make sure that, he didn't, he's being responsible.
As they followed, Kenny says Jamelia appeared to lose her way.
Petway had actually indicated that they were driving around in circles like they didn't know where they were going.
The detail is a red flag for detectives.
It's not strange getting lost. However, when it's leading up to a shooting, we were suspicious of that at that time. It almost felt like they were trying to find a good location to set the victims up.
Kenny says they finally arrived at the apartment complex where the sisters were staying with their mother. He followed Jamelia into a back parking lot.
Collier's truck, driven by Petway, drives up through the alleyway and parks in the back where the residents park at. The girls get out.
The group decides that they're going to split because Natalia has to go to work in the morning, but Jamelia and Richard still want to hang out. Natalia goes inside and she's like, listen, I'm going to bed. Jamelia is about to get into the SUV with Richard and Kenny. She opens the door, but then she realizes that she needs to freshen up before she gets back into the car. So she goes inside of the apartment after Natalia to go freshen up.
Kenny and Richard wait in the vehicle for Jamelia to return. But before she does, an ambush.
Shots ring out, multiple shots. This sounds like a cannon going off.
Kenny didn't see anything.
When you hear that many bullets being fired off, most people, then the instinct is to, put your head down. Mr. Petway didn't see who the shooter was, but then of course he saw his friend injured and then went to try to get help.
He told us he ended up going to the entranceway to the Corby's apartment.
Kenny, he's banging on the door saying to call 911 and that Richard's been shot. Natalia is the one that ends up making that call.
Kenny was also upset that he didn't see or do anything. I pretty much eliminated him as probably a person involved. If he got out, went over and shot Richard, didn't really think that. He was really shook.
Detectives are trying to figure out what could have possibly happened here. Could it have been a robbery?
I didn't really suspect it to be a robbery because from all intents and purposes, I think we had Richard's personal items, effects, cards, money, and there was no attempt to, Petway was already out of the car, so there's no attempt to pull Rich out and take the vehicle. It was a nice customized Cadillac Escalade truck.
They didn't try to take the vehicle. They didn't demand any money. They came straight to the vehicle and opened fire.
Investigators suspect the fact that Kenny escaped unscathed wasn't an accident.
You could see the grouping of the bullets, the projectiles and the entries into the seat were really pretty tight grouping, so it indicated Kenny was not a target at all. Richard Collier was the target.
It seemed like it was personal. We just didn't know why, and we had to figure that out.
Investigators head back to the station where Jamelia and Natalia Corby await questioning.
Quite honestly, the females were under a little bit of suspicion from us. I felt it was strange, them getting lost on the way home. It just seemed like they were either trying to buy time or, who knows, set up a shooting at a different location. So we were looking at that pretty hard at the time.
There was a question could this be a lover's triangle or some sort of crime of passion?
Following the shooting of Jacksonville Jaguars football player Richard Collier, investigators head to the station to interview the two women who were with him moments before the shots rang out.
Jamelia, out of the two sisters, was the more priority to interview. We knew Jamelia was more involved with Richard. She was supposed to go with them afterwards. Her sister wasn't.
I kept asking, if he was okay, if he's all right. They wouldn't tell me.
It was a heated interview at times. You want to be as compassionate as you can, but you can't patty cake with them. All I'm looking for is the truth.
They asked me all kind of questions like, have I thought about killing someone before? Did I want him dead? Would I hurt him? I was getting that kind of feeling. We were like suspects, not witnesses. I couldn't believe it happened. It was kind of traumatic for me. And, I liked him a lot. And It was just hard to deal with. I'm sorry.
Detectives confront her about getting lost.
I just moved to my mother's house for a week or two until my apartment was ready, so I didn't know, the area too well. I also required glasses to drive, and I didn't wear them. I was trying to be cute. I didn't wear my glasses. So I got a little turned around trying to get onto the highway.
It can be easy to, get turned around from San Marco to go to Riverside. She goes, we left. Basically, we started driving around in circles. We kind of got lost for a minute, and she explained it, and I could tell her tone was genuine.
I was like, let me go ahead and freshen up. I had been drinking, dancing, and I had to, use the restroom. So I was like, let me go inside and freshen up. So I get out and then I go to the door and I heard gunshots. About 5 to 7. Pop, 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 pop.
Immediately after the gunshot stop, they hear a banging on the door, and it's Kenny. He's banging on the door, saying to call 911 and that Richard's been shot.
Detectives believe that Jamelia is telling the truth.
She said the things I expected her to say, and that I would expect somebody innocent and not setting it up per se.
Investigators speak with her sister, Natalia, in another room.
I've never been interrogated, and I didn't know what was going on. I didn't even know if Richard was still alive at this point.
She pretty much says the same thing, that they were at the club. But one thing Natalia did say that was a little different was that there was this man that kept staring at Richard pretty much the entire night.
I do remember seeing a guy. I saw him a couple times throughout the night. The last time I noticed him is outside the club. It did seem like he was kind of focused on where we were at. I just thought it was weird.
That was kind of something that concerned us. We would want to see who was maybe following them.
After hours of interrogation, Natalia and Jamelia are allowed to leave. As day breaks, the shooting makes big headlines.
The news hit, instantly. Everyone was talking about it first thing in the morning.
This is a story that blew up nationwide. You have a professional football player, Jacksonville Jaguar, that has been shot multiple times.
This made big news. Was getting contacted by the New York Times. ESPN was all over that.
And Richard Collier is still fighting for his life.
They weren't sure if he was going to survive.
I had an officer staying there with him the whole time. He was intubated, so we knew he wouldn't be able to speak if he gained consciousness, and it was going to be a long recovery or time before we can get to speak to him in person, if he even makes it.
On the morning of September 2nd, 2008, Jaguars football player Richard Collier remains in critical condition. Richard was shot multiple times following a night on the town with friends.
Law enforcement wanted to investigate whether or not something had just happened at the club that would have caused someone to do this shooting.
To find out, they place a follow-up phone call to Kenny Petway. Kenny says he just heard from one of Richard's exes, who had also been at the club. She told Kenny about a conversation she had with Richard that night.
The ex-girlfriend walks up to Richard in the club and says, hey, there's this guy that keeps staring at you here in the club. So Richard says he does remember the guy from several months back and getting into a fight with him, and he didn't think much of it.
If Richard got into a fight, investigators want to know with who.
That was a good place to start for us.
One of the things that law enforcement will do is they'll start, going through their database. Are there any previous cases where the victim was involved in anything that could lead them to a potential suspect?
My partner finds a report on one of our searchable databases where a man had him run in with a Jaguar player, and he only knew him as Big Rich. We don't know who Big Rich is.
Could Big Rich be Richard Collier?
Richard Collier was 6'7", 340, 350 pounds. They were able to verify that Richard's nickname was, in fact, Big Rich.
We immediately knew this was something. We're all looking at it. And in the report, so this guy is at a club. He gets into an altercation with Richard Collier. He goes home, but then he decides to come down to the police memorial building. So this, we knew right off the bat, this dude was pissed.
The man who filed the complaint is 32-year-old Tyrone Hartsfield.
He states that he's in the club, minding his own business, and this guy, this big dude, bumps into him and then attacks him.
But according to the report, investigators later determined that wasn't what happened.
Turns out a drink had gotten inadvertently spilled on him. It got into a pushing match. And Richard, in self-defense, put one on Tyrone Hartsfield. Down goes Frazier, and the game's over.
The police determined that Richard Collier hadn't done anything wrong, and all he was doing was defending himself.
Nothing was ever done. The case was dropped.
Detectives look into Tyrone's background.
When I ran his name, he had a history. He's a very active and successful drug dealer up on the north side of our town. It's a very violent area.
Mr. Hartsfield had 6 felony convictions, but the police didn't want to just jump in and go right after him based on just this alone.
They're doing everything that they need to do to make sure that they have all of the information that they need before they go to Tyrone.
Unknowingly, Tyrone helps them get a start.
So when Mr. Hartsfield made the police report referencing the fight that he had with Mr. Collier at the club in April, he actually gave his correct phone number, which is unusual. Usually drug dealers don't like to provide their real phone number, but he did.
That honestly made the hair on the neck stand up. We were excited about that. So we ordered phone records on Tyrone Hartsfield's phone.
While they wait for the records to come in, police ask the public for help.
You have a celebrity football player being shot, and so there's a lot of public interest in the case. Going forward to the public and asking for their assistance in the investigation is important. They also announced that there was a reward of $1,000.
You also have the Jacksonville Jaguars adding to this reward, adding $10,000 because they really want answers.
We were getting tips. We started getting information from confidential sources and other people that were in the community. We started hearing that a guy named Q did the shooting. Then we found out Tyrone's nickname was Q.
So now you start looking for witnesses. The detectives went to the club. They spoke to people that worked at the club. There were other football players from the Jaguar team that were there that night. We went and spoke to those players to see if they saw anything or heard anything.
They hear from several people who were in the club that night that Tyrone Hartsfield was the man who was staring Richard Collier down.
One person that we spoke to identified Hartsfield. He knew him, told us about the fight that happened at the club a few months prior to the night of the shooting, and that Hartsfield had said that he was going to get revenge on him.
Then, almost a month after the shooting, investigators learn that Richard is awake.
Despite the serious nature of his injuries, Richard Collier was able to survive, and that's just from really good medical work they were able to put on him.
He suffered catastrophic injuries where he is essentially paralyzed from the waist down. He suffered clots in one of his legs, which caused him to have to partially amputate one of his legs.
He's had numerous infections. He's really just trying to make it through. And now he has to grapple with the fact that he will never play football again.
Detectives pay Richard a visit at the hospital. His memory from that night is hazy.
He did not see who shot him. He said he was sitting in the car and gunshots rang out.
I asked him about the fight. He said, some small dude tried me and, spilled a drink and he tried to swing on me.
Richard gave him a black eye, and he hit him ultimately because Richard was defending himself.
I had some photographs with me, and when I end up showing him photographs, he goes, "That's the guy I hit right there." And he pointed him out.
Detective Sullivan shows him these pictures, and Richard IDs Tyrone as the man that he gave the black eye in the club.
It was all starting to come to a head. We had this incident, somebody he'd gotten into it with. He's at this club, and it's starting to shrink and settle in on a suspect.
In October 2008, police in Jacksonville, Florida, are closing in on Tyrone Hartsfield as the main suspect in a shooting that nearly ended the life of Jaguars player Richard Collier.
Detectives have a name and they have a face, but before they confront Tyrone, they want to make sure that all of their ducks are in a row.
After weeks of waiting, Tyrone's cell phone records are in.
We got the cell site data, and it actually showed him at the club, in the same area as the club. It doesn't say he's at this address, but it pings off the cell towers that are closest, and it was close to that area.
Around 2 a.m., the phone moved.
We start looking at the individuals that he had called that night. One of those individuals tells us about Stefan. Stefan Wilson was a friend of Mr. Hartsfield and was actually with him at the club.
Lo and behold, Stefan Wilson is a violent federal offender. He's done a robbery in Atlanta, and he's on probation for it.
So we get with his probation officer, and we arrange to meet him. We brought Mr. Wilson down to the police station, into the homicide office, and had a lengthy interview with him. Of course, at first he denied any knowledge of the shooting.
And then I make him think about his probation.
If he was, in fact, out with Mr. Hartsfield, who is a convicted felon, this could violate his probation. So he could be facing time.
He did not want to go back to prison, so he decided to cooperate.
He finally says, "I'm going to tell you what's going on." And he ends up saying, "I was with him that night."
He tells them that he recalls Mr. Hartsfield seeing Mr. Collier in the club and that he was hell-bent on revenge.
Tyrone Hartsfield was waiting for the perfect opportunity. And when he saw his person that had done him wrong, he seized it.
Mr. Wolf tells law enforcement that Mr. Hartsfield was calling people to try to get a gun.
He had somebody from the north side bring it down, and apparently he got it.
they decided to step outside and wait on Mr. Collier and his party to leave. And at around 2 o'clock when the club was closing, Mr. Collier and his party left. And that's when they followed him from the club to Riverside into the apartment complex. Hartsfield was driving. Stefan was in the passenger seat.
They watched the two cars pull into the back of the apartment complex. Tyrone parked out front.
Hartsfield told Stefan that he would be right back, and he left with a gun in hand. Stefan said a minute or two later, he hears several gunshots. Hartsfield comes back, running, told Stefan to slide over and drive. He got into the passenger seat and told him that he shot the victim, that he had gotten revenge, basically. And they drove off and left the scene.
We're like, this dude's telling the truth. It's starting to click, so you're like, oh man, we're hot and heavy on this. We get this one.
Investigators asked Stefan for help.
We ask him to wear a wire and go speak to Hartsfield about the shooting, and he agrees to do it. So Detective Sullivan and I give him a recording device.
A recording device for him to put in his pocket instead of, like, you know, the traditional wire.
That same day, Stefan meets with Tyrone Hartsfield outside Tyrone's mother's house.
Tyrone Hartsfield was pretty hesitant and nervous about saying anything. He was aware that something was possibly up.
We're not listening in real time. We were posted up hidden, and because it had taken so long, we got nervous. Detective Sullivan and I decided to do a drive-by, and Stefan was outside talking to Mr. Hartsfield. Stefan had taken his shirt off, which we thought was weird. But it turns out when Stefan was talking to Hartsfield, Stefan told him, the police want me to be a witness against you. Stefan took his shirt off to prove he wasn't wearing a wire.
Well, man, I stripped for you right back there. Ain't nothing on me, dog. I see you. Ain't nothing on me, I see you.
Thankfully, he did not have any visible evidence that he was recording.
Tyrone opens up.
They ain't got nothing on me. Anything they got on me.
He said that the police didn't have a case against him, and as long as you don't flip, then I'm good.
He also makes statements about the importance of them getting their story straight.
Before they even got you, I can do it. Right there. That's what I'm saying. So if you can keep me, how to do this? I did not tell him you pulled the trigger. I did not tell him that you fought. I did not tell him that.
He never came right out and said, yes, I ran up and shot him, but he definitely said enough to indicate that he had committed the shooting, the attempted murder. That was the rest of the puzzle that we needed for our probable cause to arrest, so we immediately got an arrest warrant.
On October 18th, 2008, almost 6 weeks after Richard was shot, Tyrone is arrested by U.S. Marshals.
He's cocky and arrogant, comes in there and just, you know, I'm not gonna speak to y'all without a lawyer.
At a hearing a month after his arrest, Tyrone Hartsfield pleads not guilty. The judge orders him held without bond.
We had a definite security threat then. We were really worried about it, that if he got out, that Hartsfield was gonna ambush Richard Collier.
About a year later, on October 26, 2009, Tyrone Hartsfield is brought to trial for the charges of attempted murder against Mr. Collier. The state, right out the gate, in opening statements, tells the jury that this is a case about revenge.
This man had gotten beaten up by a professional football player. His ego took a huge blow. And then the community knows, word gets around that you've gotten beaten up by a Jacksonville Jaguars player. He really wanted some sort of retribution for what happened.
Seeing Richard for the first time since the incident was shocking, because now at this point he was in a wheelchair.
He's a humble individual. He's a big, imposing person, even in a wheelchair. I mean, he's a big guy.
He is able to tell the jury that he had no idea at the time who had done this shooting. He did not see the shooter, but he did tell them that he recognized Mr. Hartsfield from that previous altercation earlier that year prior to the shooting.
Stephon Wilson takes the stand.
Stephon cooperated. He wore a wire, and his agreement to wear that wire helped the case. This was some fantastic police work and prosecutorial work, and it tied Tyrone Hartsfield to the scene in terms of being at the nightclub and also to the scene where the shooting took place.
Stephon Wilson knocked it out of the park on the stand. He was very credible, he was engaging, and he was likable by the jury.
The gun wasn't found, but we have enough evidence putting Tyrone Hartsfield there. Circumstantially, with the phone records and all the other evidence, it unequivocally shows you that this person, Tyrone Hartsfield, is the person who did it.
Tyrone's defense suggests blame could be placed elsewhere.
The strategy of the defense was to point out the fact that there could have been other suspects who were upset with Mr. Collier.
They point to several people, including the Corby sisters.
We went and testified, and the defense attorney, she was just trying to make us look bad, trying to make us look like, trying to trip us up, make us look like liars.
The sisters don't waver.
We didn't have anything to do with it whatsoever. We were just there that night.
Tyrone takes the stand in his own defense.
He cried through most of his testimony. He talked about being wrong at the nightclub when Richard Collier hurt him, and yeah, he was mad about it and all that, but he would never resort to this. He just kept on going and going, trying to get sympathy.
He gets none from the jury.
We got a verdict in like 3 hours, and he's found guilty.
Mr. Hartsfield was sentenced to life in prison as a habitual offender. After Mr. Hartsfield was sentenced to life in prison, he obviously appealed. And for many years, those appeals have been denied. However, it appears at some point there was a decision by prosecutors and in conjunction with the victim to come to a negotiated resolution or a plea deal to have some finality in the case.
Part of the resentencing was him admitting that he did it, and he did go from life to 27 years, I believe. And Mr. Collier agreed to that.
In the years after the shooting, Richard Collier rebuilt his life.
He's living a heroic life. He's basically taken this horrific situation and turned it into
December 11th, 2014. In a quiet suburban neighborhood tucked into the hills of Upper Hutt, New Zealand, Christmas was only 2 weeks away. The streets of Timberlea were settling into another ordinary summer evening. Porch lights glowed softly against the fading daylight. Families sat around dinner tables. Children drifted between living rooms and backyards. Somewhere in the distance, a A lawnmower had finally gone silent after a long day of work. The air carried that familiar feeling of safety that small communities often take for granted, the belief that nothing truly terrible could happen here. Timberlea was the kind of place where people recognized familiar faces at the local shops. The kind of place where neighbors waved from driveways and where doors were sometimes left unlocked because trust still felt stronger than fear. But on that evening, something was moving through the neighborhood. Something invisible. Something no one could hear. Something no one could stop. Because while residents were finishing dinner and preparing for another peaceful night, a man was driving toward Blueberry Grove carrying a belief so powerful, so twisted, and so detached from reality that within the next hour it would leave one woman dead, several others fighting for their lives. And an entire community struggling to understand how friendship could transform into unimaginable violence. The man behind the wheel was 36-year-old Retimana T. Carew Nichols. To the people who knew him, he was not a stranger. He was not a masked intruder. He was not a shadow lurking in the darkness. He was a friend. A familiar face. Someone who had spent years building relationships with the very people whose lives would soon be shattered forever. And perhaps that is what makes this story so disturbing. The danger did not arrive from outside the community. It came from within. Long before the first scream echoed across the neighborhood, before blood-stained driveways and front yards, before police cars flooded the streets with flashing lights, the foundations of this tragedy had already been laid inside the human mind. A mind that had become a prison. A mind consumed by paranoia. A mind that could no longer distinguish reality from fear. Some crimes begin with greed. Some begin with jealousy. Others begin with revenge. This one began with a glass of water. A simple request. An ordinary gesture between friends. The kind of moment that happens thousands of times every day without anyone giving it a second thought. But on this particular evening, that small act would become the spark that ignited a chain of violence no one could have predicted. As daylight faded over Timberlea, Nichols arrived at the home of Thomas Guerin. The two men shared a history stretching back more than 2 decades. They had known each other for years. Trusted each other. Spent time together. The kind of friendship that survives changing jobs, changing addresses, and the endless passage of time. To Thomas, there was no reason to fear the man standing in front of him that night. Why would there be? Sometimes the people who destroy our lives are not strangers. Sometimes they are the people we invite inside. And that is one of the cruelest truths at the center of this case. Because Thomas had no way of knowing that his longtime friend was carrying more than hidden weapons. He was carrying a hidden reality. A reality that existed only inside his own head. Investigators would later discover that Nichols was suffering from severe paranoid psychosis. But mental illness alone does not explain the horror that unfolded. To understand this story, we have to understand what paranoia does to perception. Imagine believing that everyone around you is lying. Imagine believing that people you love are plotting against you. Imagine feeling certain that danger exists even when no evidence supports it. Then imagine that every glance, every conversation, every harmless action becomes proof of a conspiracy. The human brain is designed to protect us from threats. But when that system breaks, it can transform ordinary events into terrifying illusions. And for Nichols, reality had begun slipping away. The people around him could not see what he saw. Could not hear what he heard. Could not feel the fear that consumed him. Yet to him, that fear was real. Every bit as real as the houses lining the streets of Timberlea. Every bit as real as the friends who trusted him. Every bit as real as the weapons concealed beneath his clothing. As darkness settled across the neighborhood, nothing appeared unusual from the outside. No alarms. No warnings. No signs of the catastrophe waiting just beyond the horizon. The homes stood peacefully beneath the evening sky. Cars rested quietly in driveways. Televisions flickered behind curtains. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The world continued as normal. And perhaps that is what makes tragedies like this so haunting. They rarely announce themselves. There is no dramatic music. No flashing sign. No voice whispering that disaster is only minutes away. Life simply continues. Until suddenly it doesn't. Somewhere nearby, people were likely discussing holiday plans. Children were probably thinking about Christmas presents. Families were preparing for the final weeks of the year. Yet within a matter of moments, an entirely different story was about to begin. A story of survival. A story of grief. A story of betrayal. And a story that would force investigators to ask a difficult question. What happens when the most dangerous weapon in a crime is not an axe, but a delusion? Because when police officers later arrived at the scene, they would encounter a landscape of violence that stretched beyond a single victim. Blood. Chaos. Multiple attack locations. Witnesses struggling to comprehend what they had just seen. A community staring into the face of something it could not easily explain. The facts themselves seemed almost impossible to process. A trusted friend attacking another friend. A mother rushing toward danger. A neighborhood transformed into a crime scene. And at the center of it all, a man whose perception of reality had become dangerously fractured. Yet for every discussion about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and justice, one truth remains unchanged. A woman named Sandra Guerin lost her life. A family was torn apart. A son would spend the rest of his life carrying memories of a night that began like any other. And no courtroom verdict could ever restore what was taken away. In the years that followed, journalists would report the facts. Investigators would reconstruct timelines. Psychiatrists would analyze the mind of the killer. Judges would weigh responsibility against mental deterioration. But beneath all of those discussions lies a far more human story. A story about trust. A story about friendship. A story about how quickly normal life can collapse. And a story about a mother whose final moments were spent rushing toward the sound of danger. Not away from it. Toward it. Because she heard something wrong. Because someone she loved was in trouble. Because that is what mothers do. Tonight, we are going to retrace every step of that terrible evening. We will examine the lives of the people involved. We will explore the psychological descent that preceded the attack. We will follow investigators as they piece together a crime that shocked New Zealand. And we will confront the uncomfortable questions left behind when violence emerges from the intersection of friendship, paranoia, and fear. This is not merely the story of a murder. It is the story of how reality itself can become a battlefield. A battlefield where one person's delusion becomes another person's nightmare. And it all began on a warm December evening in Timberlea. With a visit between friends. A glass of water. And a decision that would change countless lives forever. Before we can understand the violence that erupted on the evening of December 11, 2014, we need to spend some time in the place where it happened. Because crimes do not occur in a vacuum. They unfold within communities, among families, between people whose lives have been intertwined long before police reports and courtroom proceedings ever exist. And in this story, the setting matters. The neighborhood matters. The relationships matter. The illusion of normalcy matters. Timberlea sits within Upper Hutt, a city in New Zealand's Wellington region, surrounded by rolling hills, native bush, and winding suburban streets. To an outsider, it looks like the kind of place people move to when they want distance from the chaos of larger cities. There is space here. Space between houses. Space between people. Space to build a quiet life. In December, New Zealand experiences summer rather than winter. While much of the world associates Christmas with snow-covered rooftops and freezing temperatures, December in Upper Hutt often arrives with long daylight hours, warm afternoons, and the smell of freshly cut grass drifting through residential neighborhoods. The days are brighter. The evenings stretch longer. And life seems to slow down. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, families begin preparing for holidays. Children count down the days. Shopping centers grow busier. Neighbors exchange greetings over fences. People start planning visits, meals, and gatherings. December carries a particular atmosphere. A sense of anticipation. A sense of comfort. A A feeling that the year is gradually coming to a close. That was the world surrounding Blueberry Grove in December of 2014. Blueberry Grove was not a place known for violence. It was a small residential street lined with family homes, driveways, garages, gardens. The ordinary architecture of ordinary lives. Nothing about the street suggested that it would one day become the focus of national headlines. Nothing about it hinted at the tragedy waiting in the future. If you had driven through the neighborhood during daylight hours, you would have seen people walking dogs, children riding bicycles, residents tending gardens, and neighbors exchanging casual conversations. The street felt familiar, predictable, safe. And perhaps that is why what happened there felt so shocking. Because the violence did not occur in some abandoned warehouse. It did not happen in a dangerous district known for crime. It happened in a place that looked remarkably similar to countless suburban neighborhoods around the world. The kind of place where mothers expected their children to return home safely. The kind of place where friends visited each other's houses without hesitation. The kind of place where trust still existed. At the center of this story stood the Guerin family. While public records reveal only limited details about their private lives, the picture that emerges is one of a close-knit family rooted within their community. Sandra Guerin was 55 years old. To understand her role in this story, it is important to understand something fundamental. Sandra was not the intended target that evening. She did not invite violence into her life. She did not seek confrontation. She did not know that her final moments were approaching. She was simply a mother. A woman living her life. A woman whose world revolved around the people she loved. People often become statistics after tragedy. Names printed in newspaper articles. Faces attached to headlines. Victims reduced to a single terrible moment. But before she became a victim, Sandra was a person. She had routines. Memories. Relationships. Plans for the future. She had experienced triumphs and disappointments like everyone else. She had laughed at family gatherings. She had worried about people she loved. She had spent years building a life that felt meaningful. And all of that existed before violence entered the story. Living nearby was her son, Thomas Guerin. Thomas and his mother shared a close bond, one that would become painfully important on the night everything changed. Friends and family often create invisible networks around us. Relationships built over years. Connections strengthened through countless ordinary moments. Phone calls. Conversations. Meals. Celebrations. Small interactions that seem insignificant at the time but eventually become the foundation of our lives. For Thomas, one of those long-standing relationships was his friendship with Retimana T. Carew Nichols. The two men had known each other for more than 20 years. 20 years. Think about that for a moment. That is not a casual acquaintance. That is not someone you met a few months ago. 20 years means shared experiences. Shared memories. A friendship that survived changing circumstances and different stages of life. When people hear stories involving murder, they often imagine enemies. Arguments. Threats. Long-standing feuds. But this case presents something more unsettling. The relationship between Thomas and Nichols was built on familiarity rather than hostility. They knew each other. Trusted each other. They occupied overlapping worlds. And because of that trust, Thomas had no reason to suspect danger. Imagine receiving a visit from someone you have known for decades. Imagine opening the door. Offering hospitality. Engaging in normal conversation. You would not be evaluating escape routes. You would not be scanning for weapons. You would not be preparing for an attack. Your guard would be down because friendship lowers defenses. Trust lowers defenses. That reality would become one of the defining elements of this tragedy. But while Thomas saw an old friend, something very different was happening inside Nichols. To fully understand this story, we must look beyond the surface. Because not all dangers are visible. Some develop quietly, gradually, hidden behind everyday interactions. Long before the attack, Nichols was reportedly struggling with severe mental health issues. Court proceedings later revealed evidence of paranoid psychosis. The phrase itself sounds clinical, detached, almost sterile. But the lived reality can be profoundly terrifying. Paranoia is not simply being suspicious. It is not ordinary anxiety. It is not healthy caution. It is a distortion of perception. A transformation of reality. People experiencing severe paranoid delusions can become convinced that others are plotting against them, spying on them, poisoning them, or attempting to cause them harm. Events that seem harmless to everyone else take on entirely different meanings. A glance becomes a threat. A conversation becomes evidence. A coincidence becomes proof. The mind begins connecting dots that do not exist. And once those connections form, they can feel absolutely real. That is one of the most frightening aspects of severe psychosis. The person experiencing it is not pretending. They are not necessarily choosing to believe these things. To them, the danger feels genuine. The fear feels genuine. The perceived threat feels genuine. Reality itself becomes altered. By late 2014, according to evidence later presented in court, Nichols was trapped inside that altered reality. A world shaped by suspicion. A world shaped by fear. A world increasingly disconnected from the one shared by everyone around him. Yet from the outside, life continued. People saw him. Spoke with him. Interacted with him. The neighborhood carried on. No one could look at a calendar and predict exactly when the situation would explode into violence. No one could point to a single moment and say, this is where disaster becomes inevitable. Life rarely provides such warnings. Instead, tragedies often emerge through a series of small developments invisible until viewed in hindsight. The weeks leading up to December 11th likely felt ordinary to most people connected to this story. The weather changed. The days passed. Families prepared for Christmas. People went to work. Friends met each other. The rhythm of daily life continued. And beneath that rhythm, pressure was building. Not in the neighborhood. Not in the community. Inside one individual. Inside a mind struggling to separate reality from delusion. This distinction matters because it helps explain one of the central tragedies of the case. The people around Nichols were not preparing for conflict. They were living normal lives. Thomas was not anticipating betrayal. Sandra was not anticipating danger. Kane Love was not anticipating violence. Diane Meiser was not anticipating becoming part of a criminal investigation. None of them woke up that morning expecting their lives to intersect with a homicide case before the day ended. Like most people, they likely assumed tomorrow would resemble today. That assumption is one of the quiet privileges of ordinary life. The belief that routines will continue. The belief that familiar people will remain familiar. The belief that danger belongs somewhere else. But as the sun moved across the sky on December 11th, those assumptions were moving toward collapse. The streets of Timberlea looked peaceful. The homes looked peaceful. The community looked peaceful. Yet hidden beneath the surface was a growing disconnect between reality and perception. A disconnect that would soon become catastrophic. The most chilling aspect of this story is not simply that violence occurred. Violence, unfortunately, exists in every society. The truly disturbing element is how ordinary everything appeared beforehand. There were no dramatic confrontations unfolding in public. No visible countdown. No obvious signs that multiple lives were about to be permanently altered. There was only a neighborhood preparing for another summer evening. A mother spending time near family. A son interacting with a longtime friend. Residents enjoying the quiet rhythm of suburban life. And a man carrying fears that no one else could see. As darkness approached, the gap between appearance and reality grew wider. The community saw normality. Nichols saw threats. The community saw friends. Nichols saw enemies. The community saw safety. Nichols saw danger. Those competing realities were moving toward a collision. And when they finally collided, the consequences would leave one person dead, several others seriously injured, and an entire nation asking how a friendship spanning more than 2 decades could end in such unimaginable bloodshed. The answer to that question would begin to reveal itself on the evening of December 11th, when a familiar vehicle arrived at a familiar house on Blueberry Grove, and a visit between old friends became the opening chapter of a nightmare that no one present would ever forget. Every true crime story eventually arrives at a painful reality. Before there is a victim, there is a life. A complete life. A life filled with memories, routines, dreams, disappointments, laughter, private struggles, and countless moments that never appear in police reports. When tragedy strikes, people often become frozen in time. Their names become attached forever to the worst day of their lives. Newspaper articles reduce them to a single sentence. A single photograph. A single moment. But Sandra Guerin was not a headline. She was not a case number. She was not evidence. She was a woman who had spent 55 years building a life that mattered to the people around her. And to understand the true weight of what happened on December 11, 2014, we have to spend time with the person whose absence would leave the deepest wound. Sandra Guerin was a mother first. That role seems simple when spoken aloud. Just one word. Mother. Yet within that word exists an entire universe of responsibilities, sacrifices, fears, hopes, and acts of love that often go unnoticed. The details of Sandra's private life remain largely shielded from public view, which is often the case in crimes that receive sudden media attention. The public learns the facts of the crime, but the quiet details of a victim's life frequently remain known only to family and close friends. What survives in court records and news reports are fragments. Small glimpses. Pieces of a much larger picture. And those fragments tell us something important. They reveal a woman deeply connected to her family. A woman whose final actions were driven not by fear for herself, but concern for someone she loved. Long before violence entered the story, Sandra had already lived through decades of ordinary human experiences. She had watched years come and go. Watched seasons change. Watched relationships grow. Like millions of mothers around the world, she had likely spent countless hours worrying about people she loved. Not because anything terrible had happened, but because that is what love often looks like. Love worries. Love checks in. Love notices when something feels wrong. Love runs toward people who need help. That final truth would become devastatingly significant. By 2014, Sandra's life was centered around family and community. The neighborhood where she lived was familiar territory. The faces were familiar. The streets were familiar. The rhythms of daily life were familiar. There is a particular comfort that develops when people spend years in the same community. You learn which houses turn their lights on first in the evening. You recognize familiar cars. You know the sounds of the neighborhood. The barking dogs. The children playing outside. The lawnmowers on weekends. The quiet that settles over residential streets after sunset. These details become so ordinary that most people stop noticing them. But they create something valuable. A feeling of belonging. A feeling of home. For Sandra, Timberlea was not merely a location on a map. It was the setting of her everyday life. And at the center of that life stood her son, Thomas. The bond between parent and child evolves over time. When children are young, parents protect them from scraped knees, schoolyard problems, and childhood fears. As children become adults, the relationship changes. The responsibilities shift. The conversations become different. But one thing often remains constant. The instinct to protect. The instinct to help. The instinct to respond when something feels wrong. No matter how old a child becomes, many parents never stop seeing them through the lens of love. To the outside world, Thomas was an adult man. To Sandra, he was still her son. That reality would shape the final moments of her life. Yet on the afternoon of December 11th, there was no indication that anything extraordinary was about to happen. The day began like countless others before it. The sun rose. People went about their routines. Cars moved through the neighborhood. Life continued along its familiar path. There is something heartbreaking about ordinary days that end in tragedy. Not because they begin differently, but because they don't. No one wakes up expecting disaster. No one receives a warning. No one is handed a script explaining how the day will end. Instead, people make plans for tomorrow. They think about errands, meals, phone calls, family, the future. Sandra almost certainly had plans beyond December 11th. People always do. There were likely things she intended to do the following week. Conversations she expected to have. Moments she expected to experience. That is what makes sudden violence so cruel. It interrupts not only a life. It interrupts a future. A future filled with events that will now never happen. As evening approached, the neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm. Families returned home. Dinner preparations began. The warm New Zealand summer light gradually softened. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed threatening. But while Sandra moved through her evening, someone else was moving toward the neighborhood carrying a very different reality inside his mind. Retimana T. Carew Nichols. The man who would ultimately take her life. The tragedy becomes even more painful when we consider one particular fact. Sandra was not involved in any conflict with him. She was not the focus of his delusions. She was not the source of his paranoia. She was not the person he believed had wronged him. Yet she would become the victim. Many crimes follow a recognizable pattern. An argument escalates. A grudge intensifies. Two people become locked in direct conflict. This case did not unfold that way. Sandra's death emerged from circumstances she neither created nor anticipated. She found herself caught in a storm that had been building elsewhere. A storm she likely knew nothing about. And perhaps that is one reason her story resonates so deeply. There is an innocence to her role in these events. She was not seeking confrontation. She was not escalating violence. She was responding to distress. Responding to danger. Responding to the possibility that someone she loved needed help. As the evening progressed, Thomas was spending time with a man he had known for more than 20 years. 2 decades of friendship. 2 decades of shared history. That length of time creates assumptions. You assume you know someone. You assume you understand their character. You assume you can predict their behavior. Most of the time, those assumptions are correct. But occasionally, reality proves more complicated. While Thomas interacted with his longtime friend, Sandra remained nearby, unaware that events were moving rapidly toward catastrophe. The image is difficult to escape. A mother spending an ordinary evening. Completely unaware that within a short period of time her life would end. There is a profound sadness in that thought. Not because it is unique, but because it is universal. Every victim of sudden violence exists in 2 versions. There is the person before the crime, and the person remembered after it. The first version is often forgotten. Yet it is the one that matters most. Sandra before the crime was not a victim. She was a mother, a neighbor, a member of her community, a woman living an ordinary life. The tragedy transformed how the world would remember her. But it should never define who she was. The most revealing insight into Sandra's character comes from her final actions. When violence erupted, she did not remain hidden. She did not run away. She did not lock a door and wait for someone else to intervene. She moved toward the disturbance. Toward uncertainty. Toward potential danger. Toward the sound that suggested something was wrong. Human beings reveal themselves most clearly in moments of crisis. When fear arrives unexpectedly, people make choices in fractions of a second. Some choices are instinctive. Some are conscious. Some emerge from years of habit and personality. Sandra's response tells us something powerful. It suggests concern outweighed caution. Love outweighed fear. The desire to help outweighed the desire to protect herself. She heard something wrong. And she responded. Not because she knew exactly what was happening, but because someone she cared about might have been in trouble. It is a simple act, yet also an extraordinary one. The world is filled with people who freeze during emergencies. People who hesitate. People who hope someone else will act first. Sandra was not one of them. When the moment arrived, she moved. And in doing so, she unknowingly stepped into the path of unimaginable violence. The tragedy of her story lies not only in how it ended. It lies in why she became involved at all. She became involved because she cared. Because she was a mother. Because helping someone she loved felt natural. As investigators later reconstructed the events of that evening, they would discover a sequence of actions measured in minutes. Just minutes. A handful of moments separating ordinary life from irreversible loss. That is all it took. Years of memories. Years of family relationships. Years of experiences. All confronted by a burst of violence lasting only moments. The imbalance feels almost impossible to accept. How can decades be erased so quickly? How can a life built over 55 years be shattered in such a short period of time? Yet this question sits at the heart of nearly every homicide investigation. Violence is often brief. Its consequences are permanent. For Sandra's family, the aftermath would stretch far beyond police investigations and court proceedings. Birthdays would arrive without her. Holidays would arrive without her. Family gatherings would arrive without her. Her absence would become a permanent presence. An invisible space that could never truly be filled. This is why victim stories matter. Because justice alone cannot tell the entire truth. Courtrooms focus on evidence. Investigators focus on facts. But families live with loss. And loss exists long after legal proceedings conclude. By the time the sun began setting over Timberlea on December 11th, Sandra Guerin had no reason to believe she was living the final hours of her life. She was simply moving through another evening. Another ordinary day. Another chapter in a life that seemed destined to continue into tomorrow. But tomorrow was already slipping away. A longtime friendship was about to collapse into violence. A son was about to fight for survival. And a mother, driven by nothing more than love and concern, was about to make a decision that would place her directly in the path of a nightmare unfolding just outside her door. The peaceful evening was ending. The violence was about to begin. And the story of Sandra Guerin was about to become the emotional heart of a tragedy that would leave an entire community mourning a woman whose only mistake was answering the call of someone she loved. December 11th, 2014. The evening had settled gently over Timberlea. The last traces of daylight lingered above the hills surrounding Upper Hutt, casting long shadows across driveways and rooftops. Houses glowed with warm interior lights. Families were winding down after another ordinary day. Nothing in the neighborhood suggested that within minutes multiple lives would be shattered forever. At Blueberry Grove, Thomas Guerin welcomed a man he had known for more than 20 years. Retimana T. Carew Nichols was not a stranger standing at the door. He was a longtime friend. Someone whose presence did not trigger alarm. Someone who belonged. That fact would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. Because danger rarely looks dangerous when it wears a familiar face. The two men spent time together in the garage area of the property. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about the interaction. It was the kind of scene that unfolds every day between friends. Conversation. Familiarity. Routine. At some point, Nichols asked for a glass of water. A simple request. An ordinary request. The sort of request that carries no significance at all. Thomas handed him the water. And for a brief moment, the evening continued as expected. But inside Nichols's mind, reality was already beginning to fracture. Later investigations would reveal that he was suffering from severe paranoid psychosis. At that moment, however, no one around him could fully understand what was happening inside his head. After drinking the water, Nichols became convinced that something was wrong. The taste. The sensation. Something in his mind interpreted the experience as evidence. Evidence that Thomas had poisoned him. Evidence that his longtime friend had betrayed him. Evidence that he was under attack. There was no proof. No toxicology. No actual poisoning. Nothing to support the belief. But that is the terrifying nature of paranoia. Once the delusion takes hold, facts become irrelevant. The imagined threat feels real. The fear feels real. The danger feels real. And in that distorted reality, Nichols believed he was facing an enemy rather than a friend. The transformation happened quickly. One moment he was standing with Thomas. The next, violence erupted. Hidden beneath his clothing was a tomahawk-style axe. A weapon he had brought with him. Without warning, he pulled it free. There was no lengthy argument. No dramatic confrontation. No escalating exchange. Only sudden violence. The first strike came with devastating force. Thomas barely had time to react. The attack was immediate. Brutal. Explosive. The man standing in front of him was no longer behaving like the friend he had known for decades. The garage became a scene of chaos. Thomas was struck repeatedly. The blows landed against his head. His shoulders. His body. Pain arrived instantly. Confusion arrived even faster. Victims of sudden attacks often describe a surreal feeling in the first moments. The brain struggles to process what is happening. Reality feels impossible. This cannot be happening. This cannot be real. This cannot be my friend. Yet the injuries were real. The weapon was real. And survival quickly became the only thing that mattered. Thomas fought through shock and injury. Blood flowed from his wounds. Adrenaline surged through his body. Every instinct focused on escape. He managed to break away. Not because the attack stopped, but because remaining where he was meant death. Injured and desperate, he fled. Every step required enormous effort. His body was damaged. His vision likely blurred by pain and panic. But he kept moving. Toward help. Toward safety. Toward anyone who could save him. As he escaped the immediate attack, the violence spilled beyond the garage. And that is when Sandra Guerin became involved. Inside the property, something was clearly wrong. There were sounds of struggle. Sounds of distress. Sounds no mother could ignore. Sandra reacted instinctively. She moved toward the disturbance. Toward the danger. Toward her son. She did not know exactly what she was about to encounter. She simply knew something was wrong. For parents, that instinct is powerful. When a child appears to be in trouble, concern often overrides caution. She stepped into a situation that was already spiraling out of control. What she encountered was unimaginable. Instead of finding an argument or misunderstanding, she found a violent attack unfolding before her eyes. Her son was injured. His attacker was armed. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. In another universe, perhaps her appearance might have interrupted the violence. Perhaps it might have created a moment of hesitation. Perhaps it might have changed the outcome. But not on this night. Not in this story. Nichols turned his attention toward Sandra. The woman standing before him was not threatening him. She was not attacking him. She was not armed. Yet she became the next victim. He struck her, knocking her to the ground. The attack escalated. What followed was swift and devastating. At some point during the confrontation, Nichols armed himself with a larger axe. The weapon was even more lethal. Even more destructive. Sandra was now completely vulnerable. The attack that followed left her with catastrophic injuries. Court proceedings would later reveal that she suffered multiple fatal blows. The violence was overwhelming. Relentless. The kind of violence that leaves no opportunity for defense. No opportunity for escape. No opportunity for survival. Within moments, Sandra Guerin's life was ending. A woman who had spent 55 years building memories, relationships, and a family was dying in the place she should have been safest. Near her home. Near her loved ones. Near the people she cared about. The cruelty of the moment is difficult to comprehend. She had entered the situation because she wanted to help. Because she heard distress. Because she was concerned for her son. That instinct led her directly into the path of lethal violence. By this point, the scene had become a nightmare. Thomas was seriously injured. Sandra was mortally wounded. The neighborhood's peaceful evening had transformed into chaos. But the violence was not over. Not even close. Many offenders stop after achieving their immediate objective. Nichols did not. Instead, he continued moving through the neighborhood. The danger spread. The violence spread. The fear spread. Not far away lived Kane Love. What happened next demonstrated that the situation was no longer confined to a single confrontation. Nichols approached another property. Another person. Another life. Kane suddenly found himself facing an armed attacker. Like Thomas and Sandra before him, he had little warning. The assault began quickly. The axe became the instrument of another brutal attack. Kane suffered severe injuries. The struggle was desperate. Violent. Chaotic. Unlike Sandra, however, Kane fought and survived. During the confrontation, the axe itself broke. The force of the struggle damaged the weapon. For many attackers, that might have ended the assault. But Nichols continued. Using the broken handle. Using whatever remained available. The violence had become irrational and uncontrolled. Every encounter carried the potential for another death. Every moment created new victims. Kane eventually managed to escape inside the house. A barrier separated him from his attacker. A small distance. A temporary refuge. Enough to save his life. But even after that encounter ended, the nightmare continued. As Nichols moved through the area, another resident crossed his path. Diane Meiser. She had no connection to the original conflict. No involvement in the events that had begun at Thomas's property. Yet she too became part of the tragedy. She was assaulted while moving through the neighborhood. Compared to the injuries suffered by the other victims, her wounds were less severe. But the psychological impact would undoubtedly remain. One ordinary evening had suddenly become a scene of terror. A peaceful suburban street now contained multiple victims, multiple crime scenes, and a killer moving unpredictably through the neighborhood. Fear began spreading among residents. People who only minutes earlier had been enjoying a quiet summer evening were now confronted with a terrifying reality. An armed attacker was nearby. No one knew where he would go next. No one knew whether the violence was finished. No one knew how many victims there might ultimately be. Then came the moment that likely prevented even greater tragedy. Members of the community intervened. Two local residents encountered the unfolding situation and made a decision that required extraordinary courage. They acted. Confronting a man who had already attacked multiple people. A man still capable of violence. A man who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill. The risk was enormous. The outcome uncertain. Yet they moved forward. In many crime stories, people become bystanders. In this one, two individuals stepped directly into danger. A struggle followed. Not between police and suspect. Not yet. Between ordinary citizens and a violent offender. Somehow, they managed to restrain him. To hold him. To prevent him from continuing his rampage. Minutes later, police arrived. By the time officers reached the scene, the damage had already been done. Lives had been shattered. Blood stained the neighborhood. Families were experiencing the worst moments of their lives. Emergency responders moved rapidly between victims. Medical personnel fought to save the injured. Witnesses attempted to explain what they had seen. The scale of the violence became increasingly clear. One woman was dead. Multiple people were injured. An entire community was in shock. And standing at the center of it all was a man whose friendship with one victim stretched back more than 2 decades. A man whose distorted perception of reality had unleashed catastrophic consequences. The peaceful evening that began with a visit between friends had ended in murder. The nightmare was over. But the investigation was only beginning. For the victims, the violence had unfolded in minutes. For investigators, it would take months to fully understand what had happened. The moment police vehicles entered Blueberry Grove on the evening of December 11, 2014, they encountered something no officer ever hopes to find. A neighborhood transformed into a crime scene. The contrast was almost surreal. Only a short time earlier, the street had been another peaceful suburban road in Timberlea. Families had been enjoying a warm summer evening. Lights glowed inside homes. Residents were settling into the familiar comfort of routine. Now flashing emergency lights reflected off windows and parked cars. Police officers moved quickly between multiple locations. Paramedics rushed toward injured victims. Residents gathered behind cordons, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Confusion hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. The first challenge facing emergency responders was understanding the scale of the incident. At first glance, the scene appeared chaotic. Victims were located in different places. Witnesses had seen different portions of the violence. Information arrived in fragments. One person reported an attack near a residence. Another described a man running through the area. Someone else spoke about a woman lying injured. The details did not immediately fit together. That is often the reality of major investigations. The public frequently imagines detectives arriving at a scene and instantly understanding what happened. Real life rarely works that way. The first hours are often messy. Conflicting statements. Incomplete timelines. Uncertainty. Investigators must build the truth piece by piece. On Blueberry Grove, officers quickly realized they were dealing with multiple victims connected to a rapidly unfolding sequence of events. The most devastating discovery involved Sandra Guerin. Emergency personnel assessed her injuries. The situation was immediately clear. The violence inflicted upon her had been catastrophic. There would be no miraculous recovery. No life-saving intervention. No second chance. Sandra Guerin was dead. For investigators, that realization changes everything. An assault investigation becomes a homicide investigation. Every detail suddenly matters more. Every photograph. Every footprint. Every witness statement. Every drop of blood. The responsibility becomes immense because a victim can no longer speak for herself. The scene must tell the story. The evidence must tell the story. And investigators become the people responsible for uncovering that truth. Around the property, evidence of violence was impossible to ignore. The attack had not occurred in a controlled environment. It had unfolded across different locations and involved multiple victims. Blood-marked areas where desperate struggles had taken place. Personal belongings lay scattered. Signs of movement revealed that at least some victims had attempted to flee. The neighborhood itself seemed to bear witness to the violence. Driveways. Lawns. Paths between homes. Ordinary places that had suddenly become part of a homicide investigation. Meanwhile, paramedics focused on those who were still alive. Thomas Guerin had survived. But survival did not mean safety. His injuries were severe. The attack against him had been relentless. Medical teams worked urgently to stabilize him. The same was true for Kane Love. He too had suffered significant injuries during his confrontation with Nichols. Both men represented something crucial to investigators. They were survivors. Living witnesses. People who could potentially explain what had happened. But before interviews could occur, their immediate battle was medical rather than investigative. Their focus was staying alive. The scene itself presented a puzzle. At first glance, investigators could see evidence suggesting multiple acts of violence rather than a single isolated attack. This mattered enormously. A spontaneous altercation typically leaves a different pattern than a sustained sequence of assaults. As officers began documenting the area, they recognized that the violence appeared to have moved. It started in one location, continued into another, then spread further into the neighborhood. The path of destruction told its own story. This was not a single confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. This was a chain of violent events, one leading into another, one victim leading to the next. The next important question involved motive. Why had this happened? At the scene, there was no obvious answer. Investigators found no indication of robbery, no signs that valuables had been stolen, no evidence suggesting gang involvement, no immediate indication of a domestic dispute involving Sandra herself. The lack of an obvious motive often creates anxiety in major investigations. People feel more comfortable when violence can be explained, when a clear reason exists, when a logical sequence of events emerges. But at this stage, nothing seemed logical. A woman was dead. Several others were injured. And the apparent suspect knew at least some of the victims. The pieces did not yet fit together. As forensic specialists arrived, the painstaking work began. Photographs captured every relevant angle. Measurements were recorded. Physical evidence was collected. Nothing was too small to matter. One of the most important tasks involved reconstructing movement. Investigators needed to determine where each victim had been, where the suspect had moved, how the violence progressed from one location to another. In homicide investigations, timelines are everything. A difference of 30 seconds can change an entire theory. A forgotten interaction can explain a motive. A single witness observation can reshape an investigation. Every detail matters because every detail contributes to the larger picture. Witness interviews began almost immediately. Residents had seen portions of the incident. Some had heard shouting. Others had observed movement between properties. Several individuals had witnessed the aftermath. And 2 residents had directly participated in restraining the suspect. Their accounts would become particularly important. Not only had they prevented further violence, but they had also observed critical moments near the end of the rampage. Each witness carried only a fragment of the story. No single person had seen everything. But when investigators combined those fragments, a broader narrative slowly emerged. A familiar visitor. A sudden attack. A wounded man fleeing. A mother becoming involved. Additional assaults. A neighborhood descending into chaos. The emerging timeline was disturbing. Because the violence appeared to lack conventional logic. Most homicides involve some recognizable progression. An argument. A grievance. A financial dispute. A relationship breakdown. Here, however, the sequence seemed irrational. The victims were connected in different ways. Some knew the suspect well. Others had little or no meaningful connection to the events that started the violence. This raised difficult questions. Had the attacks been planned? Had specific victims been targeted? Or had something else occurred entirely? At the same time, detectives began examining the suspect himself. Retimana T. Carew Nichols had already been restrained and taken into custody. This provided investigators with an unusual advantage. Unlike many homicide investigations, they did not need to spend days identifying or locating a suspect. They had him. The mystery was not who committed the crime. The mystery was why. That distinction shaped the entire investigation. When detectives encounter a suspect who immediately appears connected to the violence, their focus often shifts toward motive, mental state, planning, and intent. Those questions quickly became central. Who was Nichols? What had he been doing before the attack? Had he shown warning signs? Had anyone noticed unusual behavior? The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the answers became. People who knew him described someone struggling with mental health issues. Information began emerging about paranoia, suspicion, distorted beliefs. None of this immediately excused the violence. But it raised important questions. Could mental illness explain the apparent irrationality of the attacks? Could it explain the lack of a conventional motive? Or was there another explanation hidden beneath the surface? At this stage, detectives remained cautious. Experienced investigators understand the danger of early assumptions. Mental illness alone does not automatically explain homicide. Many people struggle with psychological disorders and never become violent. The challenge was determining whether the attacks were driven by delusion, anger, personal grievance, substance abuse, or some combination of factors. Meanwhile, forensic evidence continued accumulating. Investigators examined the weapons involved. The presence of a concealed tomahawk-style axe immediately attracted attention. This detail raised troubling questions. Why had Nichols arrived carrying a weapon? Had he intended violence from the beginning? Or had the weapon been carried for another reason? The distinction would later become important when assessing intent and criminal responsibility. The larger axe used against Sandra also became a key focus. Every weapon tells part of a story. Its condition, its location, its damage. The forensic examination helps reveal what occurred during moments that no witness fully observed. By analyzing injuries and physical evidence together, investigators gradually reconstructed the sequence of events with increasing confidence. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Thomas had been attacked first. Sandra became involved while responding to the disturbance. Additional victims followed as the violence expanded beyond the original location. The pattern suggested a rapidly escalating series of assaults rather than multiple unrelated incidents. For detectives, another haunting realization soon emerged. The entire tragedy had unfolded incredibly quickly. People often imagine violent crimes as prolonged events. In reality, many occur with shocking speed. Lives can change forever in minutes, sometimes seconds. The investigation revealed just how little time separated normality from catastrophe. One moment friends were interacting. The next moment bloodshed had begun. One moment a mother was spending an ordinary evening. The next she was confronting lethal violence. The compressed timeline made the tragedy feel even more unsettling. There had been almost no opportunity for intervention. No meaningful chance for someone to recognize what was about to happen and stop it beforehand. As the night continued, officers maintained a presence throughout the neighborhood. Residents wanted answers. Families wanted reassurance. Fear lingered in the air. Many struggled to comprehend how such violence could occur in their community. The emotional impact spread far beyond the immediate victims. Neighbors questioned their sense of safety. Parents looked at their children differently. Friends reconsidered assumptions about the people around them. The crime had shattered more than lives. It had shattered certainty. Yet amid the uncertainty, investigators slowly moved closer to understanding the truth. Evidence was being collected. Witnesses were being interviewed. Timelines were being established. And somewhere within the growing mountain of information lay the answer to the question haunting everyone connected to the case. What could possibly transform a 20-year friendship into a scene of unimaginable violence? The answer would not be found in bloodstains. It would not be found in physical evidence alone. It would be found inside the mind of the man responsible. A mind that investigators were only beginning to understand. And as they dug deeper into Retimana T. Carew Nichols's psychological state, the case would take a turn far stranger, and far more disturbing, than anyone initially imagined. In the first days following the attack, the people of Upper Hutt wanted a simple answer. Why? Why had a man walked into a neighborhood and unleashed such devastating violence? Why had a longtime friend attacked Thomas Guerin? Why had Sandra Guerin lost her life? Why had multiple victims been left injured in the wake of a seemingly ordinary evening? The problem was that simple answers did not exist. For investigators, the case appeared solved on the surface. The suspect had been identified almost immediately. Witnesses had seen him. Victims had survived to tell their stories. Physical evidence connected him directly to the attacks. There was no mystery regarding who had committed the crime. The mystery centered entirely on motive. And sometimes motive can be far more difficult to understand than identity. The public often imagines homicide investigations as dramatic hunts for unknown killers. Detectives following leads across cities. Suspects hiding from authorities. Long periods of uncertainty. This case unfolded differently. The investigation became a journey into the psychological world of a man whose reality appeared fundamentally different from everyone else's. At first, detectives approached the case from every possible angle. That is standard procedure. No matter how obvious a situation may seem, investigators cannot afford assumptions. Every theory must be tested. Every possibility must be explored. Even when evidence points strongly in one direction. The first question involved the relationship between Thomas Guerin and Retimana T. Carew Nichols. The friendship itself immediately drew attention. 20 years is a significant amount of time. People do not maintain relationships for 2 decades without developing trust. Without creating memories. Without sharing parts of their lives. Naturally, investigators wondered whether something had happened behind the scenes. Perhaps an argument. Perhaps a financial dispute. Perhaps resentment that had quietly grown over time. Perhaps a conflict hidden from outsiders. These possibilities were reasonable. Many violent crimes emerge from personal grievances that develop gradually over months or years. Detectives interviewed people familiar with both men. Friends. Acquaintances. Individuals who understood the dynamics of their relationship. The more investigators looked, however, the less evidence they found supporting the idea of a long-standing feud. There were no reports of escalating hostility. No history suggesting that Thomas feared Nichols. No indication that either man had been preparing for a confrontation. Instead, the friendship appeared genuine. Which made the attack even more difficult to comprehend. If there had been no major conflict, what had triggered such extreme violence? The next possibility involved planning. Investigators knew Nichols had arrived carrying a concealed tomahawk-style axe. That detail could not be ignored. Weapons do not accidentally appear inside jackets. People choose to bring them. The discovery immediately raised troubling questions. Had he intended to attack someone before arriving? Had he selected a target? Had the violence been premeditated? These questions became central to the investigation. Because if the attack had been planned, then motive might be hidden somewhere in the suspect's past. Detectives examined his recent activities. His movements. His behavior leading up to December 11th. They searched for signs of preparation. Evidence of threats. Conversations suggesting violent intentions. What they discovered instead pointed them toward an entirely different explanation. People who interacted with Nichols before the attack described troubling behavior. Not necessarily violent behavior. Something stranger. Increasing suspicion. Growing paranoia. Unusual beliefs. Comments that did not always align with reality. At first glance, these observations seemed disconnected. Individually, they did not explain murder. But together, they began forming a pattern. The deeper investigators looked, the more that pattern emerged. This was not simply a man who had become angry. This was potentially a man whose perception of reality had become distorted. That possibility changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives began consulting mental health records, psychiatric evaluations, and expert opinions. Their goal was not to excuse the violence. Their goal was to understand it. Understanding motive often requires understanding the mind behind the crime. And the mind of Retimana T. Carew Nichols was becoming increasingly important. As information accumulated, investigators learned that paranoia appeared to play a major role in his life before the attack. Paranoia is one of those words people use casually in everyday conversation. Someone worries too much. Someone distrusts others. Someone becomes suspicious. But clinical paranoia can be something entirely different. It can reshape reality itself. Imagine walking through the world convinced that hidden threats surround you. Imagine believing that ordinary interactions contain secret meanings. Imagine viewing friends through the lens of suspicion. Imagine interpreting kindness as manipulation. Imagine perceiving danger where none exists. Over time, those beliefs can become self-reinforcing. Every event becomes evidence. Every coincidence becomes confirmation. Reality gradually bends around fear. Investigators began considering whether that process had occurred inside Nichols's mind. Then came the account involving the glass of water. The detail seemed almost absurd at first. A glass of water. Such an ordinary object. Such a harmless moment. Yet according to the emerging evidence, it may have become the catalyst for everything that followed. The theory suggested that after drinking water provided by Thomas, Nichols became convinced he had been poisoned. Not suspected. Not wondered. Not questioned. Believed. The distinction mattered. People experiencing severe delusions often do not perceive their beliefs as possibilities. They perceive them as facts. To an outside observer, the idea made little sense. There was no evidence of poisoning. No toxic substance. No motive for Thomas to poison his friend. Nothing supporting the claim. But investigators increasingly realized that objective evidence might not matter if the attack was driven by delusion. Because in that scenario, the crime was not responding to reality. It was responding to a perceived reality existing only inside one person's mind. This realization created a difficult challenge. How do investigators explain actions that appear logical within a delusion but irrational within actual reality? The answer required expertise beyond traditional police work. Psychological assessments became crucial. Mental health professionals examined Nichols. Reports were prepared. Evaluations conducted. Gradually a clearer picture emerged. One of the most significant findings involved paranoid psychosis. The condition helped explain many of the confusing aspects of the case. The absence of a conventional motive. The suddenness of the attack. The irrational targeting. The extreme nature of the violence. Psychosis does not merely alter opinions. It can alter perception itself. People suffering from severe episodes may genuinely believe things that others recognize as impossible. And once those beliefs become embedded, behavior can follow. Still, investigators remained cautious. Mental illness alone could not answer every question. Another important area involved substance use. Reports suggested previous drug use may have contributed to Nichols's deteriorating mental state. This introduced another layer of complexity. Substance abuse and mental illness often intersect in ways that are difficult to separate. Did drug use worsen existing psychological vulnerabilities? Did psychological problems contribute to substance use? Were both factors interacting simultaneously? The investigation explored these possibilities extensively. Yet even as experts analyzed his mental condition, detectives continued examining the practical realities of the crime. One detail remained particularly troubling: the concealed weapon. If paranoia alone triggered the attack, why had Nichols arrived armed? The question generated considerable discussion. Some investigators viewed the weapon as evidence of preparation. Others considered whether his paranoid worldview had already convinced him he needed protection. The distinction mattered because it touched on intent. Did he arrive expecting violence? Or did he arrive expecting danger? Those are not the same thing. And understanding the difference became essential. Meanwhile, interviews with surviving victims provided additional clarity. Thomas Guerin's account was especially important. He had experienced the beginning of the violence firsthand. His description helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. More importantly, it reinforced the apparent absence of provocation. There was no dramatic confrontation before the attack. No explosive argument. No escalating dispute. The violence appeared to emerge suddenly. Abruptly. As if a switch had been flipped. This observation strengthened the theory that the attack was linked to psychological disturbance rather than a traditional grievance. Kane Love's experience also added valuable information. His encounter occurred after Sandra's death. After the initial violence. After events had already spiraled out of control. Yet his account suggested that Nichols remained highly aggressive and irrational. The attacks were not isolated to a single emotional moment. The danger continued moving through the neighborhood. This pattern reinforced investigators' growing belief that they were dealing with someone operating under a profoundly altered perception of reality. Public reaction to these developments was mixed. Many people struggled to reconcile mental illness with the brutality of the crime. Others worried that psychological explanations might diminish personal responsibility. These concerns are common in high-profile criminal cases. Society often prefers clear categories: good and evil, victim and offender, rational and irrational. But real life is rarely so simple. The investigation increasingly revealed a situation existing within uncomfortable gray areas. A man experiencing severe psychological problems. A deliberate act of violence. A devastating loss of life. All existing simultaneously. As detectives continued their work, another important realization emerged. The investigation was not uncovering evidence of a conspiracy. Not uncovering evidence of revenge. Not uncovering evidence of financial motives. Instead, the evidence repeatedly pointed back to the same conclusion. The driving force behind the tragedy appeared to be a delusion. A false belief so powerful that it overrode years of friendship. Years of trust. Years of shared history. For many investigators, that reality was deeply unsettling. Criminal motives often follow recognizable patterns. Money. Jealousy. Anger. Control. This case involved something harder to grasp. The destruction of reality itself. A friendship that existed in one world. A perceived threat that existed in another. And when those worlds collided, people died. As forensic findings, witness accounts, and psychiatric evaluations converged, the investigation moved steadily toward a conclusion. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The violence was no longer a mystery. The sequence was becoming clear. The psychological foundation was becoming visible. Yet one final challenge remained. Investigators now believed they understood what had happened. They believed they understood why it had happened. But proving those conclusions inside a courtroom would require an entirely different battle. Because understanding a killer's mind is one thing. Convincing a court of law is another. And soon the focus of the case would shift from crime scenes and police interviews to psychiatric reports, legal arguments, and a judicial system tasked with answering one of the most difficult questions in criminal justice. When a delusion leads to murder, how should society respond? The answer would determine the future of Retimana T. Carew Nichols. But it would never change the reality left behind on Blueberry Grove. Sandra Guerin was still gone. Thomas Guerin still carried his scars. And a community was still searching for meaning in a tragedy that seemed almost impossible to understand. By the time the case entered the courtroom, the violence itself was no longer in question. Investigators had reconstructed the timeline. Witnesses had spoken. Physical evidence had been collected. Medical reports had documented the injuries. The path from the garage in Blueberry Grove to the final moments of the rampage had been carefully traced. There was little uncertainty about what had happened on the evening of December 11, 2014. The greater challenge now was determining how justice should respond. Courtrooms are often portrayed as places where truth is discovered. In reality, the truth had largely emerged long before the trial phase began. The court's task was different. Its responsibility was to evaluate responsibility. To weigh actions against intent. To balance compassion with accountability. To determine what society should do when a man suffering from severe psychological disturbance commits acts of devastating violence. For the families involved, however, legal questions were only part of the story. They were entering a process no victim's family ever truly wants to experience. A process that forces people to relive trauma. To hear details they wish they could forget. to sit in the same room as the person responsible for unimaginable pain, and to do so while remaining composed enough to endure the demands of the justice system. Months had passed since the attack. The physical wounds of the surviving victims had begun to heal. But emotional wounds operate on a different timeline. Some never heal completely. Some remain present for life. For Thomas Guerin, every step toward the courtroom meant revisiting the night that had stolen his mother. Every legal proceeding meant confronting memories most people would spend a lifetime trying to escape. The attack had not only left him injured, it had destroyed a friendship stretching back more than 20 years. There is a particular cruelty in betrayal by a stranger. There is an even deeper cruelty in betrayal by someone you trust. The legal proceedings forced everyone involved to confront that reality repeatedly. As preparations for trial moved forward, psychiatric evaluations became increasingly important. Mental health experts examined Retimana T. Carew-Nichols and prepared detailed reports regarding his psychological condition. The findings painted a troubling picture. The evidence suggested that at the time of the attack, Nichols had been suffering from severe paranoid psychosis. The court heard descriptions of distorted beliefs, persistent paranoia, the conviction that people intended to harm him, the belief that others were plotting against him. Among the most significant elements was the delusion involving the glass of water provided by Thomas. What most people would consider an ordinary act of hospitality had been interpreted by Nichols as evidence of poisoning. Not a suspicion. Not a possibility. A certainty. The distinction mattered enormously. Because criminal courts often examine not only what a defendant did, but also what he believed he was doing at the time. Mental state can influence legal arguments, sentencing considerations, and broader discussions about culpability. Yet the existence of mental illness does not erase consequences. And that reality remained impossible to ignore. Sandra Guerin was dead. Thomas Guerin had suffered severe injuries. Kane Love had survived a violent attack. Diane Meiser had become an unwilling victim in a chain of events she never saw coming. The human cost of the violence stood plainly before the court. As legal proceedings continued, many observers expected a lengthy trial. Cases involving psychiatric evidence often become complex. Experts may disagree. Attorneys may challenge interpretations. Arguments regarding mental state can extend proceedings for months. But this case took a different turn. On August 11, 2015, nearly 8 months after the attack, something unexpected happened. Nichols entered guilty pleas. The decision eliminated the need for a full contested trial. He admitted responsibility. 1 count of murder. 2 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. 1 count of assault. The guilty pleas changed the atmosphere surrounding the case. They did not erase pain. They did not eliminate grief. But they removed uncertainty. Families would not need to endure a prolonged courtroom battle over whether the attacks had occurred. The facts would not be disputed. Responsibility would not be denied. For many victims' families, such admissions can provide a measure of relief. Not closure. Closure is often an illusion. But relief. A chance to avoid months of additional testimony and legal conflict. A chance to focus on healing rather than litigation. Yet even after the guilty pleas, important questions remained. What sentence would be appropriate? How should the court balance severe mental illness against the extraordinary violence committed? How should society respond when delusion becomes deadly? The sentencing hearing drew significant attention because it sat at the intersection of criminal justice and mental health. These cases are never simple. On one side stood evidence of serious psychiatric disturbance. On the other stood overwhelming evidence of harm. The court had to consider both. Justice requires acknowledging complexity without losing sight of victims. During the proceedings, the details of the attack were revisited. The timeline. The injuries. The sequence of events. The impact on survivors. Each fact reinforced the magnitude of the tragedy. The attack on Thomas. The murder of Sandra. the assault on Kane, the attack against Diane. Together they formed a picture of violence extending far beyond a single moment of rage. The court also examined the broader context surrounding Nichols's mental condition. Reports described a man whose perception of reality had become dangerously distorted. A man consumed by paranoia. A man trapped inside beliefs that others could not see. Yet even as experts explained his mental state, another reality remained impossible to ignore. Many people experience severe psychological difficulties without harming anyone. Mental illness may help explain behavior. It does not automatically excuse it. That tension sat at the heart of the sentencing process. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful moments came from the victim impact statements. These statements represent one of the few opportunities victims and families have to speak directly about the consequences of crime. Not legal consequences. Human consequences. The difference matters. Court documents can describe injuries. Medical reports can quantify damage. But only families can describe loss. Only families can explain what has been taken from them. For Thomas Guerin, the opportunity carried enormous emotional weight. The man responsible for his suffering was not merely an attacker. He was someone Thomas had once considered a friend. Someone who had occupied a trusted place in his life. Someone whose betrayal had fundamentally altered his future. As Thomas addressed the court, years of friendship collided with the reality of violence. The contrast was devastating. The memories of shared history. The trust. The familiarity. All of it overshadowed by the events of one terrible evening. One statement in particular captured the depth of the wound. Thomas expressed that he would never forgive the man who had killed his mother. The words carried extraordinary force because they emerged from experience rather than anger alone. Forgiveness is often discussed after tragedy. People speak about it as though it is inevitable. As though enough time automatically heals every wound. Reality is more complicated. Some losses remain too profound. Some betrayals cut too deeply. Some actions create scars that never fully disappear. Thomas's words reflected that reality. The courtroom listened. The judge listened. And somewhere within those words was the voice of every family member forced to continue living after violence ends. Because when a murder occurs, the crime scene eventually disappears. The police leave. The media moves on. The legal process concludes. But families remain. They continue living with the consequences. Day after day. Year after year. The sentencing hearing ultimately focused on accountability. Justice Joseph Williams faced the difficult task of balancing all the factors before the court. The brutality of the crimes. The loss of life. The lasting impact on survivors. The psychiatric evidence. The guilty pleas. The need to protect society. The need to acknowledge victims. Each factor carried weight. Each demanded consideration. When the sentence was finally delivered in September 2015, it reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. Life imprisonment represents one of the most severe penalties available within the New Zealand justice system. It is reserved for the gravest offences. The Crime Society views as fundamentally incompatible with continued freedom. But the sentence included another important element. A minimum non-parole period of 14 years and 6 months. This meant Nichols would not even be eligible to seek parole until that period had been served. The ruling communicated a clear message. Mental illness had been acknowledged. Psychiatric evidence had been considered. Yet the magnitude of the violence required substantial punishment. The sentence reflected both realities simultaneously. For observers, the decision underscored an uncomfortable truth. The justice system can punish. It can imprison. It can protect society. But it cannot reverse tragedy. No sentence can restore Sandra Guerin's life. No sentence can erase Thomas's memories. No sentence can undo the fear experienced by Kane Love or Diane Meiser. Justice operates within limits. Important limits. Necessary limits. The law can respond to harm. It cannot erase it. As the hearing concluded, one chapter of the story reached its end. The investigation was over. The legal proceedings were over. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been imposed. The state had spoken. Yet outside the courtroom, another chapter continued. The chapter that matters most to those left behind. The chapter involving grief, recovery, memory, and the long process of rebuilding life after unimaginable violence. Because while the justice system had reached its conclusion, the aftermath of December 11, 2014, would continue for years. Perhaps for the rest of their lives. The prison sentence closed the legal file. But it could never close the emotional one. And that reality would become the final lesson of the Timberley tragedy. The end of a court case is not the end of a story. For victims and families, it is often only the beginning of learning how to live with what remains. After the sentencing ended and the courtroom slowly emptied, there was a moment of silence that no official record could capture. Not the silence of resolution. Not the silence of closure. But the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Outside, life in Upper Hutt continued in its familiar rhythm. Cars moved along the roads. Shops opened and closed. Families went to work and school. Summer returned again, as it always does in New Zealand, bringing long daylight hours and warm evenings that seemed almost disconnected from what had happened in Timberley. On the surface, everything looked normal. But for those who lived through December 11, 2014, normality had already changed its meaning. Some days divide life into before and after. That evening was one of them. For Thomas Guerin, the world that existed before the attack could never be fully recovered. There is a particular weight carried by survivors of extreme violence, especially when the violence is not random but tied to someone once trusted. Memory becomes complicated. Ordinary places turn into triggers. Familiar relationships become fractured in ways that cannot easily be repaired. The loss of his mother, Sandra Guerin, was not only the loss of a loved one. It was the loss of a presence that had shaped his life in countless unseen ways. The small habits of care, the everyday conversations, the silent reassurance of knowing someone is there, all of it disappeared in a single evening of chaos. Grief in cases like this does not follow a clean path. It does not move in stages that end neatly. It returns unexpectedly, in quiet moments, in familiar streets, in ordinary sounds that suddenly carry new meaning. For Kane Love, survival came with its own burden. Physical injuries heal, but the mind often retains sharper memories than the body. The experience of facing sudden, uncontrollable violence can leave lasting psychological effects. Sleep, trust, and everyday comfort can all be reshaped by what happened in a matter of minutes. For Diane Meiser, even though her injuries were less severe, the impact of being drawn into a violent incident she had no connection to would remain part of her personal history. Survivors often describe a lingering awareness that the world is not as predictable as it once seemed. That sense of safety, once broken, does not easily return. And for the community of Timberley, the aftermath was more subtle but equally profound. Neighbors who once shared casual greetings now shared something heavier. The awareness that violence had entered their streets. The realization that familiar faces could be linked to unimaginable events. The quiet questioning of how well we truly know the people around us. Communities recover outwardly long before they recover inwardly. Houses are repaired. Streets are cleaned. Life resumes its schedule. But underneath that surface, memory remains. December 11th became a reference point, even for those who were not directly involved. A date that marked a shift in how safety was understood. In cases like this, one of the most difficult truths is that explanations do not always bring comfort. The conclusion that mental illness played a significant role in the actions of Retimana T. Carew Nichols helped investigators understand the mechanism of the violence. It helped the court determine legal responsibility. It provided structure to something that initially appeared chaotic. But understanding does not undo harm. Knowing why something happened does not erase what happened. That distinction is often where families struggle the most. The human mind naturally searches for meaning in tragedy. If there is a reason, then perhaps the event feels less random, less senseless, less unbearable. Yet even when reasons are identified, the emotional reality remains unchanged. Sandra Guerin was still gone. Thomas Guerin still had to live with the aftermath. No explanation could restore what had been taken. Over time, the case of the Upper Hutt attack became part of a broader conversation about mental health, violence, and responsibility. It raised difficult questions that do not have easy answers. How should societies respond when severe psychological illness intersects with violent behavior? Where is the boundary between treatment and punishment? How can warning signs be recognized earlier? And perhaps most importantly, how can individuals in distress be supported before situations escalate beyond control? These questions extend far beyond one case. They reflect challenges faced by mental health systems and communities around the world. Early intervention remains difficult. Stigma still prevents many people from seeking help. Resources are often limited. And even when support exists, it is not always accessed in time. The tragedy in Timberlea became a reminder of how fragile the gap can be between internal suffering and external consequence. A gap that, once crossed, cannot be reversed. For those studying the case years later, one of the most striking aspects remains the speed at which everything unfolded. There was no long period of escalation visible to outsiders. No extended warning visible to neighbors. Instead, there was a sudden collapse from ordinary interaction into catastrophic violence within a very short time frame. That speed is part of what makes such events so difficult to prevent. Human behavior does not always follow predictable patterns. Even when warning signs exist, they may not be recognized in time. Even when concerns are raised, they may not fully capture the urgency of the situation developing inside a person's mind. As the years passed, the legal case closed, but the human story continued in quieter ways. Families learned to live with absence. Survivors adjusted to new versions of themselves. The community incorporated the memory into its history. And the name Sandra Guerin remained tied to a night that changed many lives. In true crime narratives, there is often a temptation to search for finality. A moment where everything feels resolved. A clear ending that allows the story to be set aside. But real events rarely offer that comfort. There is no ending that restores what was lost. There is only continuation. Life after. The final chapter of this case is not about the offender or the court judgment. It is about the lasting imprint left on human lives. The way a single evening can echo across years. The way memory persists long after headlines fade. The way ordinary places hold extraordinary weight for those who remember what happened there. Timberlea still exists. Blueberry Grove still exists. The houses still stand. The streets still carry daily life forward. But for those connected to December 11, 2014, those locations are not just geographical points. They are reminders. Of trust. Of violence. Of loss. And of how quickly the boundary between safety and tragedy can disappear. This is where the story settles. Not in resolution, but in remembrance. Because in the end, the most lasting consequence of the Upper Hutt tragedy is not found in court records or police files. It is found in the lives that continue, carrying with them the memory of a night when everything changed, and nothing could ever be the same again. If there is one final thought left after the story of Timberlea, it is this: violence rarely arrives in the way people expect it to. It does not always come from strangers. It does not always follow obvious patterns. It does not always announce itself with clear warning signs that everyone can recognize in time. Sometimes it comes wearing familiarity. Sometimes it speaks with a trusted voice. Sometimes it sits across from you in a garage and asks for a glass of water. The case of the Upper Hutt attack forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human relationships and human perception. Trust, which is normally a foundation of safety, can become a vulnerability. Familiarity, which usually brings comfort, can sometimes obscure danger. And mental illness, when severe and untreated or poorly understood, can distort reality in ways that are invisible to everyone except the person experiencing it. Yet even acknowledging those realities does not make the outcome easier to accept. Because at the center of this story remains a simple fact that cannot be complicated away. A woman lost her life. Sandra Guerin did not die as a result of a distant conflict or an abstract force. She died in a moment of direct human violence, while responding to what she believed was a situation involving someone she loved. That detail alone carries a weight that statistics can never fully express. It speaks to instinct, to compassion, to the way people often move toward danger when someone they care about might be in trouble. Her final actions reflect something deeply human, a refusal to ignore distress, a willingness to step forward rather than step away. And in the cruel logic of that night, those very instincts placed her directly in harm's way. For Thomas Guerin, the story becomes one of unimaginable reversal. A friendship spanning decades collapsing in minutes. A moment of trust becoming a moment of survival. A lifetime of shared history overwritten by violence that no memory can separate from what came before. The human mind struggles to reconcile those contradictions. How someone known as a friend can become an attacker. How a familiar presence can become a source of trauma. How the past can remain unchanged while its meaning is permanently altered. For Retimana T. Carew-Nichols, the case remains a tragic illustration of how distorted perception can escalate into irreversible consequences. The legal system ultimately recognized the role of severe mental illness, but it also reaffirmed a boundary that societies cannot abandon. Suffering does not erase responsibility for harm caused to others. That tension sits at the heart of many modern criminal cases involving psychiatric conditions. Understanding behavior does not mean accepting its outcomes. Explaining violence does not undo it. And for the wider community, the lesson is quieter but no less important. Safety is not only a matter of place. It is a matter of perception. The assumption that danger exists elsewhere, in other neighborhoods or other lives, is often what makes events like this so shocking when they occur in familiar surroundings. Timberlea was not a place defined by violence. It was a place defined by ordinary life. That ordinariness is precisely why the events of December 11, 2014, left such a lasting imprint. In the years that follow cases like this, public attention eventually fades. New stories replace old ones. Headlines move on. But for those directly affected, time does not function in the same way. Memory does not obey news cycles. Grief does not expire. And trauma does not dissolve simply because the world's attention has shifted elsewhere. What remains is adaptation. A slow and often uneven process of learning how to continue in a world that contains absence. Families adjust to new routines shaped by what is missing. Survivors rebuild a sense of stability that is permanently changed. Communities incorporate the memory into their identity, even when they do not speak of it often. There is no final moment where everything becomes resolved. No point at which the story fully ends. Instead, there is a gradual settling, where life continues alongside memory rather than beyond it. The streets of Blueberry Grove still exist. The homes are still occupied. The neighborhood still carries on with everyday life. Yet for those who know its history, it also carries something invisible. A reminder that ordinary places can hold extraordinary pain. That trust can be tested in ways no one expects. And that a single evening can divide time into what was before and what came after. In the end, the most honest way to understand this case is not through the lens of shock or spectacle, but through the people who lived through it. A mother who acted on instinct. A son who survived what should never have happened. A survivor carrying both physical and emotional scars. A community that learned, in the most difficult way possible, that safety is never absolute. And a truth that remains long after all legal processes conclude. Life can change in an instant. And when it does, the echo of that moment can last far longer than the moment itself. This is where the story ends. Not because it is resolved, but because there is nothing left to explain that can change what it already became. Only memory remains. And the lives that continue carrying it forward. There is a point in every true crime story where facts stop being enough. Where timelines, evidence, and courtroom decisions have already done their work. Where what remains is something quieter, heavier, and more human. The Upper Hutt case reaches that point not in the moment of violence, not in the courtroom, but afterward, in the long shadow it leaves behind. Because even though the legal system closed the file on Retimana T. Carew Nichols with a life sentence and a minimum non-parole period, the real story never fits inside a verdict. It continues in the people who were forced to live through it. Sandra Guerin's absence is not a concept. It is not an abstract loss measured in legal language. It is a daily reality that reshapes everything around it. The empty chair at family gatherings. The conversations that no longer happen. The ordinary moments that no longer include her presence. Grief in this form does not stay still. It moves through time, changing shape, appearing in unexpected places, sometimes years later, when something familiar suddenly brings back what was lost. For Thomas Guerin, the impact of that night is layered in a way that cannot be separated into simple categories of physical injury and emotional trauma. The attack did not only harm his body. It altered the foundation of trust that once existed between him and someone he had known for decades. That kind of rupture is difficult to explain to those who have never experienced it. The mind tries to hold two opposing truths at once, that a person can be both familiar and dangerous, both remembered and feared, both part of the past and responsible for destroying it. Survivors often describe life after such events as divided into two versions of themselves. The person they were before, and the person they became after. The space between those two versions is not always visible from the outside, but internally it can feel like a permanent shift in how the world is understood. Safety becomes something that is no longer assumed, but checked. Trust becomes something that is no longer automatic, but measured. For the wider community, the story of Timberlea became a quiet reference point rather than a constant public discussion. That is how most communities process tragedy. The initial shock creates attention, questions, and fear. Over time, daily life returns. People go back to routines. Children grow up. Streets feel familiar again. But underneath that normality, memory remains. Not always spoken, but present. What happened in Blueberry Grove became part of local history in that way. Not as something constantly visible, but as something that changed how people understood vulnerability. It reminded residents that violence does not always come from outside a community. It can emerge from within relationships, from within trust, from within moments that would otherwise feel ordinary. One of the most difficult aspects of this case is the role of mental illness, because it forces a confrontation with uncertainty. The evidence of paranoid psychosis provided a framework for understanding how Nichols may have perceived reality. It offered explanations for beliefs that had no grounding in fact. It helped the court and investigators understand why a glass of water could be interpreted as a threat, why a friend could be seen as an enemy, why ordinary interaction could become the trigger for catastrophic violence. But explanation is not the same as resolution. Mental illness can help describe a pathway. It cannot undo the consequences of that pathway once it has been taken. This tension is what makes such cases so difficult for societies to process. There is a need to understand, because without understanding there is only confusion. But there is also a need to acknowledge harm, because without acknowledgement there is only abstraction. Between those two needs, the truth of what happened often feels incomplete in either direction. The justice system in this case attempted to hold both realities at once. It recognized the psychiatric evidence. It acknowledged the severity of Nichols's condition. But it also imposed a life sentence, reflecting the seriousness of the harm inflicted. That balance is not perfect, and it is not meant to be. It is an attempt to respond to a situation that itself was not orderly or predictable. In the aftermath, what remains most consistent across all accounts is the speed of the transformation. How quickly an ordinary evening became something else. How rapidly trust became danger. How fast a familiar environment became a scene of irreversible loss. That speed is part of what makes the memory so persistent for those involved. The mind struggles to accept how little time was needed for so much to change. Years later, the events of December 11, 2014, remain fixed in the lives of those connected to it. Not as an active daily presence, but as something that shaped the direction of everything that followed. For families, for survivors, for witnesses, the timeline of life is divided by that date in a way that cannot be undone. There is no final explanation that fully satisfies every question raised by this case. No single perspective that resolves all contradictions between mental illness, responsibility, violence, and loss. Instead, there is only the recognition that multiple truths can exist at once. That a person can be unwell and still cause irreversible harm. That a friendship can be real and still end in tragedy. That a community can be safe and still experience violence. What endures is not the case file, but the human consequence. A mother remembered. A son changed. A community marked. And a reminder that the boundary between ordinary life and tragedy is sometimes thinner than it appears. In the end, the story does not conclude with answers. It concludes with what remains after answers are no longer enough. Memory. Loss. And the quiet persistence of lives that continue forward, carrying what happened into every tomorrow that follows.